If you have an interest in horses and love learning more about horses, the horse industry, teaching, or even managing your own horse business, then you're in the right place. We would love you to join us on our mission, which is to improve the lives of horses around the world through the education of riders, handlers, and trainers. So get comfortable, listen in, and enjoy.
Our guest on Horse Chats today is Jacqui Panozzo. Now, Jacqui's from Worm Tech Australia. So her business is actually about the management, or she's got a parasite management service for horse owners. And we're going to talk about that very soon. But first of all, I'd just like to remind everyone that this podcast is brought to you by International Horse College, and the mission of International Horse College is to improve the welfare of horses around the world through safe education of their riders, handlers and trainers. So have a look now at the wide variety of horse courses incorporating horse welfare and safety around horses at International Horse College. It's internationalhorsecollege.com. Now, as part of our welfare education to people, we're bringing on Jacqui because some management of worms, I'm sure, is important. Now, Jacqui, you there? How are you today?
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm really good and excited to chat to you all about worms and managing them.
Wonderful. Jacqui, before we get started, do you have a favourite quote?
What I always try and tell people is that worms aren't bad.
Mm-hmm.
They're natural.
Yep.
And I always think of that part in Finding Nemo where the shark says fish are friends. And I don't quite know how to work that into like worms are friends. It doesn't quite work as well. But that's the sort of take-home message I want people to think about. Is that worms are meant to be there. They're not all bad. And like with anything, it's the amount of worms that cause the issues, I think.
So the management of the worms, which is what you do. So
yep, that's what I do.
How did you decide to get into worm management, Jacqui?
So back at uni, I did an undergrad of veterinary bioscience, so animal sciences, with a big focus on like biotech part, less zoology, more biotech, that sort of stuff. And then I liked that, so I stayed on and did an honours degree, and then I stayed on and did a PhD. And they say, don't pick your subject, pick your supervisor. And the academic at uni I got along really well with was a parasitologist.
Okay.
So that's how I ended up as parasitologist.
Brilliant.
I wouldn't have thought I'd be here 10 years ago. 10 years ago I was studying viruses, so never would have thought And then during my study I realised there's no or very limited resources out there for people with horses. I've owned horses all my life, so the move into parasite management for horse owners was just sort of a natural progression from there.
We've got a book. It's a free download at International Horse College, and one of those, we have what you might start off as a hobby, then you might go into an employee within the horse industry, then you might go on to having your own business within the horse industry, but another one is that you might already have an interest and then you just bring in the horses afterwards because you've already got the horse experience. But it sounds to me like you were interested in the science and then brought the horses in afterwards. Does that sound about right?
Yes. Yeah, pretty much. As a kid at school, I loved my science and I loved my horses. How do you make them work together? There's actually not many jobs out there.
No. Do you work for a uni or something, or are you self-employed?
I'm self-employed now. I have been doing part-time work back at the uni, totally different things. And Worm Check I started in 2019, and only in the past few months have I quit all my other jobs just to try and focus, just on this.
Now, within Australia, what are the main types of worms? But I'm also going to ask you, is there any worms overseas that we do worry about bringing into the country, any that others that we've got to worry about?
No, not really. There's actually not many horseworms. There's a few that your horses, I'm down in Victoria, up in the tropics, and throughout the tropical areas of the world, there's always a few more interesting things that are around, but they're not going to be widespread or seen very often.
That's right. We're in Australia and we're, this is because you're an equitana educator, we're talking to you. and it's about Australian worms that we're talking about. So, yeah, if you'd like to just tell us a bit more about the main worm species and types of worms in horses in Australia.
So what I'm going to do is I have a PowerPoint slide here that I'm going to try and share with you, just for me to talk to you so you can see the words as I read them. So pretty much 5 types of worms in horses in Australia. When you look at a worming box, like the drench box, the list is huge because they go through all of the individual species names. They also add in a few extras that are present in Australia, but they're not very common, so you won't have to deal with them on a regular basis. So the thing about worms is your horse will always have them, and therefore you always have to be managing them. And the most common worm in all horses in Australia are your small strongyles. They're also called cyanthostomes. Now, a strongyle is a roundworm. That means it's round. You've got other worms that aren't round, like tapeworms. Tapeworms are flat. So we have small strongyles, or strongyles in general. They're a very, very big family of worms. Anything that eats grass will be infected with strongyles. So you have horse strongyles, you have cow strongyles, sheep strongyles. The thing about them is they don't cross over species. So like cows don't get horse strongyles, horses don't get cow strongyles. So you just have to worry about the horse species because they're the ones that are going to infect your horses. Strongyles can be small or large. The large ones are the really, really bad ones that used to kill horses. They used to be the leading cause of colic. They're also called bloodworm, but they're very rare now because of how effective modern drenches are. So we very rarely see large strongyles. They're popping up again over in Europe because of drug resistance and their management techniques. That being said, Europe are sort of leading the way in how they manage worms, so it's a whole other story of why these large strongyles are popping up. But we don't have them in Australia very often, very, very rare to see them in Australia, so you don't need to worry about them. You really need to worry about these small strongyles. Now, they are 95%. 95% is me being generous. I very rarely see anything other than strongyles on an egg count.
Okay.
The other reason small strongyles are so important is because they have such a short life cycle. So their life cycle from being a worm inside a horse to shedding eggs and a horse getting reinfected from the eggs that they shed can be as little as 6 weeks. So that means you can drench your horse and then 6 weeks later they're reinfected. The 4 other worm types that are pretty common in horses are botflies. We all know about botflies because we can see them. We get to see them every summer when they annoy our horses. We see the eggs on their legs. Tapeworms, pinworms. You might also see pinworms because they live right at the end of the intestine. And so sometimes a horse will do a poo and the pinworms actually pass out. And people get to see them. And they're pretty big. A female pinworm is probably about this long. So if you see a big long worm in your horse's poo, it's a pinworm, and actually pinworms don't cause that much damage, so you don't really need to worry about them. And then the 5th type of worm are the ascarids, and they're the ones that you see on the Facebook posts where the horse's intestines are just full of worms and they get to like 40 centimeters. Ascarids are really big. They can cause blockages. So they can actually cause colic and all sorts of issues as well. But they're mostly just in young horses, so about under the age of 4, and you can pick them up very easily on an egg count. So they are very easy to diagnose and manage if you do it appropriately. And then the other reason why strongyles are so, I've already said it, so much more important than these four is because these 4 have quite long life cycles, so between 6 and 12 months compared to your small strongyles.
Okay, so just to confirm here, which is the most important one that horse owners in Australia need to know about?
Yeah, to confirm, I think I might have gone on a bit of a thing about that. You might have already picked it up from me, but it is your small strongyles. So when people manage worms, whether that's how you manage your pasture, how you decide when to do egg counts or when to drench or what drench to use, you need to the most important thing at the top of your list for answering all of those questions is the small strongyles, not the other ones. All of these other worms can fit in to your yearly management that should always firstly focus on your small, strong girls.
All right. Now, if we're thinking about, sometimes people, especially when they're at Equitan, they have one thing. If you've got one most important thing to think about worms that horse owners need to understand to help them manage the worms in their horses, what would be the one thing that would help them? Hopefully they'll remember the whole 45 minutes of your lecture, but if they've got to remember one thing, what would it be?
Remember one thing, or maybe learn one thing about worms. There's lots and lots about worms. There's lots about worms that I don't know. What I really know about is how to diagnose them and how to sort of set up a management system for them, because that's my job. As a horse owner, you need to understand how the life cycle of the worm works, because understanding the life cycle is how you manage. I'm trying to get a screen up again, and once again, it's doing what I want it to do. So this is what I wanted to bring up nice and quickly. So this is your strong guile life cycle, and this is pretty much the life cycle for most worms, in that the adults live inside the gastrointestinal tract somewhere. So strong guiles will live in the small intestine. They lay eggs that pass out in the manure. The eggs hatch on pasture, and then the horse will eat the larvae that hatch from the eggs. Once they've eaten them, the larvae mature back into adult worms, and then they lay eggs again. So as I said before, this can all happen in about 6 weeks. The shortest amount of time is 6 weeks. So in spring and when it's warm and damp, this happens faster. In winter, when it's a bit cooler, it happens slower. And so when it comes to managing these worms and why this life cycle is so important, it's because there's things to remember, such as the fact that, so these eggs will hatch within 5 days in warmer weather. So you need to think, well, how often do I need to pick up poo? If I'm picking up poo every 2 weeks, well, those eggs have already hatched and the larvae have already left the manure. If you're picking up every 2 days, that's really good. If you're picking up twice a week, that's also pretty good. Larvae can live for 6 months in damp weather. So when it comes to you thinking about, well, how often do I need to rotate my paddocks, or how long do I need to rest my paddocks for? It's good for the horse owner to be able to look at their paddock and understand, I pulled my horses off 3 months ago. There's probably still going to be worm larvae on that pasture. And another thing that people don't realise, and this is why the life cycle is such an important thing for you to understand, is that most of the worms actually don't live in the horse. Most of the worms live out on the grass. So you are actually, when you're managing the worms that live on your property, you're actually dealing with a population of worms, population of animals that actually spend the majority of their life out on the pasture. So it's much more about pasture management to an extent than just removing the worms that are in the horse.
Interesting.
Yeah. So being able to look at this life cycle and say, yeah, I know what's happening at each point, and understanding what management technique I'm using, what impact that'll have on the overall worm population on your property. It's important to be able to understand how that life cycle works, so that you know where and when you can break it.
So we had Camilla Wishaw on a little while ago, and she talked about a lot of myths to do with feeding. I'm sure there's lots of myths that need busting about managing worms. Have you got any for us?
I do. So my first one would probably be worm at the start of each season, or worm, or even worse, worm every 6 weeks. So worming every 6 weeks is only going to drive drug resistance. So you might think, well, Jacqui, you just told me that the worm life cycle is 6 weeks. So surely if I worm my horse every 6 weeks, then what I'm doing is keeping them clean and free from worms. But all that does is, the more you expose the worms to the drenches, the more chances they have of becoming drug resistant. Once a worm is drug resistant, you can't really kill it anymore. So Myth is I need to worm my horse every 6 weeks or every start of every season. The truth is you don't. You actually might only need to worm your horse once a year or sometimes twice a year. And you can find that out using egg counts. Second myth is about rotating wormers. So it used to be you worm with, say, a red packaged wormer in autumn, in spring, or in winter, you need to worm with a green packaged wormer. So that myth actually originated back in the 70s when the wormers were really quite bad. They weren't very effective. Horses had to be tubed. The wormers back in the 70s were what we called narrow spectrum, so they didn't treat all of the worms, whereas the wormers we have now are broad spectrum and they do treat all of the worms. So back then, you did have to rotate. You had to use one, and then a few weeks later, 6 weeks later, you had to use another one to make sure you got all the worms. Nowadays, you don't need to do that. And also, rotating, just for the sake of rotating, can actually continue to drive drug resistance because people don't check for drug resistance. So the way you can check for drug resistance is you get an egg count done, you worm your horse, you get another egg count done to make sure that you've got rid of all the worms.
And so is this immediately after you've wormed them or within sort of 24, 48 hours, so you've got a higher one?
So you do an egg count and then you worm them.
Yep.
And then 2 weeks after you've wormed them, you get another egg count done.
Yep.
Yeah. And so what I try and tell people is don't rotate. What you want to do is pick what drench you're going to use based on egg count, based on time of year, based on how old your horse is, based on what are your paddock conditions. Not based on, oh, I used that wormer last time. Like if you think about it that way, it doesn't really make much sense. So worm for your current infection, not your previous infection. And then I think the third myth that I'm really trying to bust for people is that, and I said it at the start, worms are not bad. So firstly, what I'll say is that horses have been around for millions of years. We domesticated them maybe 5,000 years ago. We've only started worming them for the past 50 years. So yes, some did die, but often animals that die from worms are animals that are sick from other things, that are not fed correctly, that aren't managed correctly. If you have a horse that is well looked after, well fed, you're very unlikely to actually have any issues with worms. And something that I find quite fascinating is people are starting to suspect that a lot of the digestive issues that humans are having, especially in the developed Western societies and cultures, is because we don't have worms anymore. There's been studies where they have given people whipworm, which is very unpathogenic, mild worm infection, and they found it's helped cure their inflammatory bowel conditions because worms actually can help modulate your own immune system. So often having a small burden of worms in the horse will probably make a healthier horse than a horse without any worms. It's very complicated, but all of the interactions that occur between the horse's immune system, the horse's microbiome, which helps the horse digest all of its food, and then the worm population as well. They've all evolved together, so they are all meant to live together. Yeah.
It's, you sort of think about a subject with horses and people go, oh, worming, This is really interesting, Jacqui. I like the way that you're busting these myths and saying people what you used to do. And that, this is very similar to what Camilla did. She said there's these myths that are brought to people by that have had a lot of time with horses, a lot of experience, but not scientists, more practitioners than science, where you've got the combination of the practitioners and the science, which is great. So, is there any other myths that you want to talk about?
They'll come to me later, I think.
Okay. All right.
I think they're my three big ones.
Just go over them again, 1, 2, and 3.
One is it's probably better to worm your horse less. So we really only need to worm our horses once or twice a year. We don't need to worm them every 6 weeks, every change of season. 2, we do not need to rotate wormers. What you really need to do is worm for the current infection. So you need to get an egg count done, and you need to think about paddock conditions. You need to think about your horse's age. You need to think about what's their worm burden, what worms do they have, and then make your decision. And the last one is that it's okay for your horses to have worms, and it is probably better for them to have worms than to have no worms at all.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're recommending that instead of people just grabbing a wormer, they should get an egg count done rather than just grab a wormer.
Yeah. And this is a problem with managing worms in horses compared to managing any other infectious disease that your horse would have. Your horse might show up with a respiratory infection, and you have to call the vet, and you have to get a prescription, and you have to get the vet to diagnose it as a respiratory infection before you get access to the antibiotics. And there's none of that when it comes to horseworms. You can just wander into any saddle you want or feed store, buy any wormer you want, and then use it however you want.
What's the best way for people to get an egg count? I mean, they can call their vet out to do one, but are they able to get a bit of manure that, say, hasn't touched the grass or hasn't touched any dirt and do an egg count from there? Just tell us a little bit more about what they can do.
Yeah, so my main business model is just doing egg counts for people.
Yep.
So I'm based down in Victoria, but I do accept egg counts posted, manure samples posted to me from across Australia. So you've just got to get a little fresh bit of manure, generally within 24 hours old. So often the biggest problem people have is waiting for the horse to do a fresh manure. So if it's you can just chuck a horse in a yard or a paddock by itself or stable it overnight. And as long as that sample is probably less than 12 hours old, you only need 1 nugget's worth. You package it up airtight, and then you can either send it down to me, you can send it to any other services that do egg counts, you can take it to your vet. The most important thing is knowing which horse it comes from and then making sure that it's less than 12 hours old.
Okay. Now, the other thing, Jacqui, if people, just to let people know that if they're thinking, well, I need to get in contact with Jacqui, we're going to get your contact details and put them at the end of the chat. So every time I do a chat, we give you a page on Horse Chats. So that's horsechats.com. And all they've got to do is go to horsechats.com, use the search for Jacqui or search for Panozzo, or probably even search for worms or worming or egg counts, and they'll find your details. So we'll get those details soon. But just wondering before then, if you've got a horse that you might use as a bit of a scenario or a bit of a test case, one that's really improved from having some better worm management, maybe improve their health, maybe improve their behaviour, certainly their welfare. Have you got one in mind that you'd like to tell us about?
What I do have actually is a lady I did egg counts for about every 3 months over the course of a year. And so she had three horses, and they all had really good low egg counts. They were all quite consistent. They all stayed within, so for the first and second egg counts I did, they stayed within a bracket. Like egg counts can fluctuate a little bit, but they stayed within a bracket. So they were all similar to their previous egg count. And then she saw me again, and she's like, I haven't been picking up poo because her leg was in a moon boot. And so she hadn't been picking up manure for a couple of months maybe, and all the egg counts had spiked. They'd all gone up simply because she'd stopped being able to pick up manure. And that's, I think, the most – I actually quite liked seeing that, because it proved to her and to me that, when you pick up manure, your egg counts will be lower.
Yep. It certainly does make a difference. It's a bit of a pain in the neck sometimes.
It is a pain, isn't it?
If it's going to be better for the horse's welfare, then
yeah.
And
then I'm trying to think where I've seen them go down. So this is bad. I should have one of these off the top of my head. But what I do, I don't generally see them go down, but what I do see a lot of the time is people saying to me, oh, I don't need to worm them as often. And so they actually go from worming every 3 or 4 months to just sending me a sample once a year.
And Jacqui, also too, if people do send you a sample, say they get that, just small amount of manure, put it in their tight container or package and mail it to you, what sort of cost is there for that?
So I only charge $10 an egg count. It varies a lot between places. And sometimes the biggest cost for them, if they're mailing it to me, is actually the postage, because it's best to do express post, because then it gets to me within 2 to 3 days. So for me, and I've left egg counts priced at $10 because I want it cheaper than a wormer. I want people to decide, you know what, I'll pay for the egg count rather than buying on a wormer on sale for $15.
I was just going to say that would be cheaper than a wormer, wouldn't it? And if they're only doing it once a year, it's certainly better than doing it every 6 weeks.
Although, and wormers have gone up now. Like I'm like, oh, what's a wormer on sale for? And they're on sale for like $20 now.
Yep. All right. Is there anything else that people, I put it out as a challenge to, instead of just worming your horse next time, do an egg count. I think it'll be educational for horse owners just to change their practices around a bit and do egg counts rather than worming. And anything else you'd like to say that I may not have asked you about?
No, but I think it's really important that do an egg count, and it goes back on the horse owner. Like sometimes it's a bit of effort to get an egg count done, but I think it's the responsible thing to do. And it's not just for you and your horse, but it's actually for everybody. There's massive amounts of drug resistance in America. It's gotten so bad over in Europe that in some countries in Europe, especially the Scandinavian countries, you have to get an egg count done by a vet and a prescription before you can worm your horse. And if everyone here in Australia starts adopting that egg count before I worm regime, hopefully we won't get to that point with the drug resistance, because what's happening overseas, it'll happen here. Like we're on our way. And if people don't change what they're doing, I reckon 10 to 15 years, we're going to be just like Europe and America with drug resistance.
Okay. That's certainly a bit of a warning for everyone to, if we think about horse welfare, it really is better for the horse's welfare long term to do an egg count rather than just go in and blindly worm.
Yeah. And we rarely go in blindly with any other medication. So if you think about it, it's not just a paste you're putting down your horse's throat. It's a medication. It's a drug. And so have a think about why you're doing it, and have a think about, do you need to actually worm them?
Now, what's the best way? We've already said one way to contact Jacqui, and that's to go to horsechats.com, search for Jacqui, search for Panozzo, search for worms or worming, and we'll put your contact details down the bottom of that page. But what do you think is the best way? Is it like phone, email, messenger?
Messenger or email. So if you just hop on Facebook and type in worm check, my Facebook page should show up. You could contact me directly through the Facebook page. The Facebook page also has a link to the website. So you can also just go straight to Google and chuck in worm check, and either the Facebook page or the website will pop up. And like my email is on both the Facebook page and it's up on the website as well.
Okay, last thing, when you're speaking about worm checks at Equitana.
So I am on Saturday morning at 11:45 and also Sunday morning at 10:30. So if you're there either day on the weekend, you can come see me and have it in.
Okay, thanks, Jacqui. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this chat, then please comment, rate and subscribe. If you'd like any changes or recommendations for guests, then please contact us through horsechats.com. And while you're online, have a look at the government-accredited courses at internationalhorsecollege.com, registered training organisation 31352.
Remember that our comments and instructions are general in nature and do not take into consideration your individual horses or your individual ability and circumstances. If you enjoyed this podcast, then please leave your comment below.